I was 20 years old when I learned that sometimes the best way to win a fight is to look like you're running away. December 1944, Bastogne, Belgium. They don't tell you in basic training that war isn't just about who shoots straighter or who's got more guts. Sometimes it's about who can lie better with their body language. My name's not important anymore, but back then I was private first class with the 101st Airborne, attached to a mixed unit holding the perimeter around Bastogne. We'd been surrounded for 6 days when Sergeant Kowalski came up with the idea that either saved our asses or should have gotten us all killed. I still can't decide which. The cold that December wasn't like any cold I'd ever felt growing up in Pennsylvania. This was the kind of cold that made your bones ache, that turned your spit to ice before it hit the ground, that made you wonder if you'd ever feel your feet again. We were dug in along the northeastern edge of Bastogne's perimeter, in foxholes that were more frozen mud than actual cover. My wool uniform might as well have been tissue paper. The army didn't expect us to be fighting in the Ardennes in winter. Hell, nobody expected the Germans to punch through like they did. I'd landed in France on D-Day, +30, full of that stupid confidence they pump into you during jump school. Thought I was tough because I could fall out of a plane and live. Bastogne taught me the difference between being tough and being desperate. By the time we got encircled, I'd already seen more combat than most guys see in a full tour, but this was different. This wasn't about taking ground or holding a position. This was about not freezing to death before the Krauts decided to overrun us. My foxhole partner was a guy named Eddie Russo from Brooklyn. He never shut up, which normally would have driven me crazy. But in that cold, hearing another human voice kept you from going completely numb inside. We shared everything: body heat, cigarettes when we had them, stories about girls we probably made up. His hands were so frostbitten he could barely work his M1's bolt, so I'd been doing most of the shooting when Jerry probed our line. The Germans had us completely surrounded, and they knew it. Every night they'd send patrols to test our defenses, trying to find weak spots. We'd hear them moving in the dark, speaking German in low voices, the crunch of their boots in the snow. Sometimes they'd get close enough that I could hear them breathing. Close enough to throw a grenade, but too dark to see where it would land. You learned to shoot at sounds, at shadows, at the general direction of where you thought the enemy might be. Ammo was the problem. We were rationed to 10 rounds per man per day by the time the encirclement hit day 6. 10 rounds. Against an entire German division that had tanks, artillery, and winter gear that actually worked. Our supply drops kept getting shot down or landing in German-held territory. I watched a C-47 go down in flames 2 days before Christmas, carrying medical supplies we desperately needed. The medics were using table linens from Belgian houses as bandages by then. Kowalski was a staff sergeant who'd fought in North Africa and Sicily. Guy had this scar across his forehead from a piece of shrapnel in Tunisia, and he never wore his helmet straight because of it. He was the kind of NCO who'd smoke with you in the foxhole, but would also put his boot in your ass if you got sloppy. On December 21st, he crawled through the snow to our position around 0200 hours, which meant something was up. Nobody moved during the night unless it was important. "Listen up," he whispered, his breath making clouds in the frozen air. "Captain needs volunteers for a little theater production tonight. We're going to make Jerry think we're pulling back from this section of the line." Eddie looked at me. I looked at Kowalski. Neither of us said anything for a second. "You want us to fake a retreat?" I finally asked. "Not fake. Real movement, real noise. We're going to pull back about 200 yards. Make it obvious we're abandoning these positions. Let Jerry hear us go. Then when they move in to occupy the foxholes we just left, we hit them from prepared positions with everything we've got." It was insane. It was brilliant. It was exactly the kind of desperate move you make when you're surrounded and running out of options. "What if they don't buy it?" Eddie asked. "What if they just shell the positions instead of moving in?" Kowalski shrugged. "Then we're back where we started. But intelligence says Jerry's conserving artillery ammo too. They want this town intact if possible. They'll send infantry." I should mention that by this point we all knew what was at stake. Bastogne wasn't just another Belgian town. It was a critical road junction. 7 highways met there. Whoever controlled Bastogne controlled the movement of supplies and reinforcements through the entire region. The Germans needed it to push their offensive west. We needed to hold it to stop them. Patton's Third Army was supposedly fighting its way up from the south to relieve us, but we'd been hearing that for days with no sign of them. That afternoon, we prepared. Kowalski had rounded up about 30 guys from different units, paratroopers, some tankers whose Shermans had been knocked out, even a couple of guys from the 10th Armored. We were a hodgepodge, but we were all cold, hungry, and pissed off enough to try anything. The plan was simple. Just after dark, we'd make a noisy withdrawal from our positions. Drop some equipment, talk loud enough to be heard, make it look panicked, fall back to a tree line about 200 yards behind our foxholes, where we'd have clear fields of fire back toward our original positions. The risk was enormous. If the Germans figured out what we were doing, they could cut us off completely, or worse, they could use the opportunity to punch through our line for real. But Kowalski had noticed something over the past few nights. The German patrols were getting bolder, more aggressive. They thought we were weakening. They thought we were on the edge of breaking. He wanted to use that confidence against them. As the sun went down, and it went down early in December in Belgium, I checked my gear for the 20th time. M1 Garand, 8 rounds in the clip, 2 extra clips in my belt, 3 grenades, K-bar knife. That was it. That was all I had between me and a German bayonet. Eddie had a Thompson with 2 magazines. We'd be part of the base of fire element once we fell back. Kowalski moved down the line, whispering final instructions. Make noise, but don't overdo it. Scared troops pulling back, not a parade. Leave your foxholes exactly as they are. Jerry needs to think we abandoned them in a hurry. At 1900 hours, it started. Somewhere down the line, a guy deliberately knocked over a tin cup. Another one started coughing loud. Someone said in a voice just a bit too loud, "Come on, we gotta move, they're gonna flank us." It felt like the worst acting I'd ever been part of, but Kowalski insisted that's what would sell it. Panicked troops don't retreat quietly. They make mistakes. I pulled myself out of my foxhole and the cold hit me like a wall. Eddie and I started moving back toward the tree line, making sure to step on every branch we could find. I let my entrenching tool clang against my canteen. Small noises that in the dead quiet of a winter night would carry across the snow to German listening posts. The withdrawal took maybe 15 minutes, but it felt like hours. Every step I expected to hear the crack of a rifle, the scream of an incoming shell, but nothing came. Just the crunch of snow under boots and the labored breathing of cold, exhausted men moving through the dark. We reached the tree line and immediately started digging new positions. The ground was frozen solid, and even with the adrenaline pumping, it was brutal work. My hands were numb, my fingers so stiff I could barely grip the shovel, but we dug anyway, because our lives depended on having cover when this went down. Then we waited. That's the part they never tell you about war. Most of it isn't fighting. Most of it is waiting. Waiting to fight, waiting to die, waiting for something to happen. And in the cold like that, waiting is torture. Your mind starts playing tricks on you. You hear things that aren't there. You see movement in shadows. You start wondering if maybe you're already dead and just don't know it yet. Kowalski had positioned us in a rough L shape, with good interlocking fields of fire covering our abandoned foxholes. He'd put the guys with bars at the corners where they could sweep the kill zone. Eddie and I were near the center with a clear view of the positions we'd just left. The moon was behind clouds, which was good for concealment but bad for seeing the enemy. We'd have to rely on muzzle flashes and movement against the snow. Around 2100 hours we heard them. The Germans were being careful, but in that kind of silence you could hear everything. The metallic click of a rifle bolt, the whisper of German being spoken, the sound of equipment shifting. They were moving into our old positions, just like Kowalski predicted. I could see them now, dark shapes against the snow, maybe 40 or 50 meters away. They were being professional about it, securing each foxhole before moving to the next. But they weren't expecting resistance. They thought we'd run, they thought we'd broken. Kowalski's signal was 3 short bursts from his Thompson. When I heard it, every weapon we had opened up at once. The night exploded with muzzle flashes, and the sound of gunfire echoing off the frozen ground. I was working my M1's trigger as fast as I could. That distinctive ping, when the clip ejected, reload, fire again. The bar to my left was hammering away on full auto, tracers arcing into the kill zone. The Germans were caught completely in the open. Some tried to return fire, but they couldn't see us in the tree line. Others tried to use the foxholes for cover, but those positions were oriented the wrong way now, designed to defend against an attack from the east, not the west. It was a slaughter, and I remember feeling sick even as I kept shooting. The engagement lasted maybe 2 minutes, though it felt longer. When Kowalski called ceasefire, the silence that followed was somehow louder than the shooting had been. My ears were ringing. My hands were shaking, though I couldn't tell if it was from the cold or the adrenaline or both. We held our positions all night, waiting to see if the Germans would counterattack, but they didn't. At first light, we moved back to our original foxholes. The snow was churned up and stained dark in places I tried not to look at too closely. We'd killed at least 20 Germans, maybe more, and we hadn't lost a single man. The ambush had worked exactly like Kowalski planned. But here's what they don't tell you about little victories in a war that big. They don't change anything fundamentally. We were still surrounded. We were still freezing. We were still running out of ammunition and food and hope. The only difference was that the Germans were a little more cautious about our section of the perimeter after that. They stopped probing us every night. They stopped assuming we were beaten. Word of the ambush spread through the defensive positions around Bastogne. I heard it got exaggerated with each telling. 30 Germans killed, then 50, then 100. Kowalski got recommended for a Bronze Star, which he never talked about and probably never received because the paperwork got lost somewhere in the chaos. But for a few days, we were the guys who'd fooled the Germans into walking into a trap. We were the guys who'd won when everyone expected us to lose. Patton's Third Army finally broke through on December 26th. I remember seeing the Shermans rolling up the road and grown men crying with relief. We'd held for 9 days surrounded, and we'd held. The Siege of Bastogne became one of those stories they tell in history books, but they always focus on the big picture, the strategic importance, the famous nuts reply to the German surrender demand, the heroic relief by Patton. They don't talk much about the small, desperate actions that happened every night in those frozen foxholes. Eddie Russo didn't make it out. Not from the siege, he survived that fine. He got killed 3 weeks later in some nameless village in Germany when a Panzerfaust hit the half-track he was riding in. I wasn't there when it happened. We'd been split up, sent to different units after Bastogne. I heard about it third-hand from a guy who knew a guy. That's how most deaths happened in that war. You just stopped seeing someone, and eventually you heard they were gone. Kowalski made it all the way to Berlin. I ran into him in '46 at a replacement depot in France, waiting to ship home. He looked older, thinner, and that scar on his forehead seemed more pronounced. We didn't talk about Bastogne. We didn't talk about the war at all. We just smoked cigarettes and watched the rain and waited for our names to be called for transport. I got home in March 1946. My parents threw a party. The whole neighborhood came. Everyone wanted to hear about the war, about being surrounded at Bastogne, about the famous siege. I told them it was cold and we were scared and we did what we had to do. They seemed disappointed, like they expected something more heroic, more dramatic. But that's the truth. War isn't a story with a clear beginning, middle, and end. It's a series of moments where you're too cold or too scared or too tired to think straight, and you just do whatever keeps you alive long enough to see the next moment. The ambush at Bastogne, the one they called the night we turned the tide, the one that supposedly broke German morale on our sector, it wasn't heroic. It was 30 half-frozen kids in the worst winter in decades, led by a sergeant who was smart enough to understand that sometimes looking weak is the best way to get strong. We made the Germans think we were retreating when we were really setting a trap. It worked because they wanted to believe we were beaten. They needed to believe it because they were just as cold, just as exhausted, just as desperate as we were. I still think about that night sometimes, usually in winter when the temperature drops and the snow starts falling. I think about Eddie Russo and his frozen hands. I think about the sounds the Germans made when we opened fire. I think about Kowalski and his crooked helmet and his cigarettes, and his absolute certainty that the plan would work. I think about being 20 years old, and so cold I couldn't feel my feet, waiting in a tree line for men I'd never met to walk into an ambush I'd helped set. They gave us medals and put our division in the history books and made movies about Bastogne. They called us heroes and liberators and the greatest generation. Maybe we were. I don't know. What I know is that we were young and scared, and we did what soldiers have always done. We followed orders, we trusted our sergeants, and we tried to survive long enough to go home. The night ambush didn't turn the tide of World War II. The war was too big for any single action to turn it. But it might have turned the tide for us for those 30 guys in that frozen tree line. It might have bought us the time we needed to hold until Patton arrived. It might have kept us alive when we probably should have died. And in the end, that's all any of us were really fighting for. Not glory or victory or liberation, but just one more day, one more night, one more chance to make it home. I'm 79 years old now. Most of the guys I served with are gone. Eddie's been gone for 58 years. Kowalski died in 1983. I go to the reunions when I can, but there are fewer of us every year. Soon there won't be anyone left who remembers what it was really like, who remembers the cold and the fear, and the desperate gambles we took just to survive. So I'm telling you this now, while I still can. The ambush at Bastogne happened because a sergeant was smart and desperate in equal measure. It worked because we sold the lie that we were retreating, and when the Germans walked into our abandoned foxholes thinking they'd won, we showed them they hadn't. We showed them we were still there, still fighting, still refusing to quit even when quitting would have been the rational thing to do. That's what Bastogne was really about. Not heroism or tactics or turning points in history. It was about refusing to quit when everything, the cold, the odds, the enemy, your own exhausted body, was telling you to give up. It was about looking weak when you needed to be strong, and being strong when everyone expected you to be weak. They thought we were retreating. They were wrong. And for one night in December 1944, in a frozen forest in Belgium, that was enough to keep us alive. That was enough to matter. That was enough to be worth remembering, even if the memory hurts, even if the cold never really leaves your bones, even if you wake up sometimes and still hear the sound of gunfire echoing across the snow. We held Bastogne, not because we were heroes, because we were too stubborn and too cold and too far from home to do anything else. Foi descobrir tarde demais quem fazia as pizzas.